Okay, so here we are in the garden tomb, and I'm starting my first segment of Dust to Dust. That's from the Bible, that Adam was made from dust and he went back to dust. And this will be my first part of several parts, talking about the burial of ancient times up to modern times. So we need to start off with the grave. The grave was in the back of the cave. People lived in caves back in the Stone Age, the Neolithic, means the New Stone Age. And there's a famous cave up by Haifa called the Carmel Cave. And that cave, the people lived in the front of the cave, and then in the back of the cave, in the earlier periods, would bury their dead there. But in the Neolithic period, we see a cave, them burying them not in the cave, but on a patio, which is just outside of the cave. So this is called intermural. Intermural means in the vicinity of your dwelling, either in the house or in the courtyard outside of the house. Extramural is what the Jewish people are involved with, because they see the grave as an unclean place, and you don't have a grave inside of your house. I know there's a lot of churches in Europe that have bishops and popes buried in the church itself, but in Jewish tradition, you don't put a person inside of your house. But it was very popular in the Canaanite period, and the Canaanites buried their relatives underneath the floor of their house. And this is called intermural burial. But in the time of the caves, people just put the bones in the back, and these are called family units or family caves. So these concepts of being buried with your family, we see also in the Bible being gathered to your fathers. So when you're gathered to your fathers, they gather your bones and place them in a specific place where all the ancestors are. So it's a curse for you to be dying out in the field and the dogs eating your bones, or being lost at sea, or being burnt to a crisp. Jews did not practice the burning of the bodies. They would gather the bones to the father into the family tomb. So in the Neolithic period, they started moving the bones outside of the cave and into the patio. And now the patio is where everyone would do their work, during the daytime, weaving baskets and making tools. So later on in the Bronze Age, you see cave burials, and the same thing, you would put the body in the opening of the cave, and then they would move the bones to the back of the cave. So it was basically one cave, and then in many instances you'd have two caves. And in Hebron, Abraham bought the Machpelah. Machpelah means doubling. So they believed there was a double cave. You had the first section of a cave for the body to disintegrate in, and then they would take the bones, gather them together after 1 year, and they would move it to the back of the cave. So the concept of being buried with your ancestors was a blessing from on high, to be gathered to your fathers. But this is in the Jewish tradition, but in other Canaanite society, in the early Bronze and Middle Bronze, they started doing pit burials. And pit burials, they would dig a pit, put the body in, and then cover it with dirt or rocks. But this came a problem because animals would dig down and start eating on the body. So what they did, they came up with a design called a cyst. And they would dig down and put a row of rocks below ground level, place the body. The body was placed in a folded up position. Sometimes there were pots and tools that were buried with them, and then they were covered with dirt, and then a pile of stones on top of that. And that kept the animals from getting to to the body. So here you have the cyst. They put rocks around the pit, and then they would pile stones on top of that. This is called a cyst grave. And then they came up with a shaft, and here in the shaft, let's see here, okay. Here in the shaft, you would put the body, fill it with dirt, and then you would put a stone on top. Then you would put the next family member. Remember, these are family tombs. The cyst tomb was, the cyst grave was an individual grave, not a family. But the shaft tombs were similar to the cut stone tombs, in which the whole family was put on. So you would put the next person, the next person, the next person, the next person. Then you would cap it off and make another shaft. The other type of shaft tomb is a shaft that goes down, and then you have a cave. So then you would put the body down, and after it decomposed, you would go down the shaft and move it into the area where the bones were collected. Now, this type of tomb may have been when Elisha was buried. He was put down here, and some soldiers during a war, there was a battle up here, and they took one of the soldiers and dropped him down, and when he touched the bones of Elisha, he resurrected to life. Here we are in the garden tomb about resurrection. So this is one of the biblical points that points towards the resurrection, that a human being can come back from the dead. And so Elisha's bones still had that Shekinah glory, in which when this dead soldier touched Elisha's bones, he resurrected to life. And that was probably this type of tomb. It's called a shaft tomb. So they had other types of burials for individuals, and one of them was a jar, a large jar, and they would fold the body in there and bury it, and this kept the animals from getting to the body. Or they would take 2 jars, and they would break them off on the ends and butt them up together. Another was called the larynx. The larynx was a clay box, and in the clay box they would have small ones for bones, or they would put the whole body in a very large clay box. So that's as the larynx. And then another type of another type of a technique to intern was a sarcophagus or a coffin. And this is kind of a drawing of one. It was made out of clay, and they had kind of like a big head on it, and their arms folded, and kind of like a place like. So this is anthropologic. Anthropoid means man, so it looks like a man. And Egyptians, as you know, in Egyptian tombs like King Tut, they had a figure of the person who was buried behind it, behind the masks there. So that gave rise to the sarcophagus. Now, sarcophaguses were large enough you could put a body into, and that became very popular during the Greek period into first and second century, very popular with the Jewish people. And so these are all individual internments. And then they also came with the ossuary, which is a bone box, which they would gather bones and put in the box. So they were either like in the garden tomb, there's a place where the body would decompose, and then they would put it into this little box. Whereas in the sarcophagus, the body remained within the sarcophagus, and it was the final resting place. All right, so let's sit down and rest for a minute. So those are my examples of the genesis of internment, of what people do. What do you do with a person who's dead? And so in the time of Jesus, you had the sarcophagi, you had the ossuaries, and then you had the rolling stone tombs. There were actually 2 types of tombs. There was one that was square like a door, and they had a rock with hinges which would open and close like this. You see a lot of these up north in the catacombs up north by Haifa. But here in the Garden Tomb was a rolling stone tomb, but it was cut away in order to build this church. So the actual tomb was down into a side of a hill, and they cut away that flat surface behind us in order to enclose it inside of a church. And that's what happened to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Holy Sepulchre Church has more historical background. This doesn't have a whole lot of background other than it is an early tomb from that period. So the rolling stone tombs were popular in the time of Jesus, and it's believed that Joseph of Arimathea was the one who had only the very rich people could afford rolling stone tombs. So this is the good possibility, and this is a very good dogma, very good example of what a rolling stone tomb would look like. I'll do a couple more films of rolling stone tombs, but this is where I'm ending this particular discussion in the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. So here we are at the Garden Tomb. Now this is from a much later date, but it's similar to what you would find in a rolling stone tomb. The doorway was enlarged at one point, and it was broken into, and they placed rocks. As you can see, there's a little niche there. We call that the nephesh. And as you look up there, there's other niches there. That's the support for the roof. This tomb was built during the Byzantine period into a church. So you had a roof, and this was all enclosed into a church going back to the Byzantine time, probably 5th, 6th century. And as we're talking about rolling stone tombs, you have a trough in which the stone rolls along and cuts off the entrance to the door. Here is a bit of a stone here with a plant on top of it. And then over here you have another stone. These are much smaller stones, but the entrance to the tomb was actually much smaller. And they would roll the stone into the place and then seal it until the next person passed away. So now we're going into the tomb. And here you have the entrance area. And then down here you have several places where you place the bodies. And then in the middle probably was the ossuary in which they would place the bones after the body disintegrated. So this may not be the actual tomb of Jesus, because we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has a much longer history. But this would be the type of tomb you would see in the time of Jesus. So the question is who was buried here, and why did they build a church over it? Here's a little notch for supporting the roof there. Why did they bury it? This is a big question.